There was a time when no one stood beside him, not in the way that truly matters. No quiet nod of understanding, no gentle reassurance, no voice saying, "I see you." Only a stillness that felt heavier than noise. He continued anyway. Each day he moved forward with the same quiet effort, even when it seemed invisible. It is a strange feeling to give your energy to something and feel as though it disappears into the air. To speak without being heard. Speak without being heard. To try without being noticed. Have you ever felt that kind of silence? The kind that does not comfort, but slowly presses against you. They watched from a distance. Not closely, not carefully. Just enough to form quiet judgments, to whisper among themselves, but never enough to truly understand. And in that space, between what was seen and what was real, he stood alone. There is a certain weight in being unseen. It is not loud. It does not demand attention. It lingers, soft, but constant, like a shadow that follows without asking. He could feel it in the way his efforts were overlooked, in the way his presence seemed to pass unnoticed, as if he were just another part of the background. And yet he did not stop. Why? Perhaps because something within him was stronger than the silence around him. Something steady, even when everything else felt uncertain. But still, it was not easy. There were moments, quiet and unguarded, when doubt would gently enter his thoughts. Not as a storm, but as a whisper. Does any of this matter? It would ask. Would it change anything if you stopped? And for a brief moment, he would feel the weight of those questions, the kind that do not demand answers, but still linger in the heart, the kind that make you pause and wonder. He saw others moving with ease, surrounded by voices, supported in ways he was not. Their paths seemed lighter, their steps more certain, and he noticed. Of course he did. How could he not? But he never allowed that noticing to turn into bitterness. Instead, he returned to his silence. There is something unusual about continuing when no one is watching. It strips away the need for approval. It leaves only one question behind. Not what they think, but what you believe. And that question is not always easy to face. In the quiet of his own thoughts, he began to understand something. Support, when it exists, can be comforting. But its absence reveals something deeper, something quieter, a kind of strength that does not rely on being seen. Still, there were days when the silence felt long, days when each step forward felt heavier than the last, when the distance between where he was and where he hoped to be seemed too wide, too uncertain. And in those moments, the lack of support did not feel like a lesson. It felt like a burden. He never spoke of it, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no one truly listening. And so, his thoughts remained his own, carried quietly within him, not shared, not explained, just held. Is it possible that silence can teach what words cannot? He began to notice small things. The rhythm of his own effort, the consistency of his steps, the quiet resilience that formed, not all at once, but slowly, almost unnoticed. like something growing beneath the surface, where no one could see. They continued as they always had, speaking, assuming, overlooking. Nothing changed on the outside. The world remained the same, but within him, something was shifting. Not loudly, not suddenly, just enough to be felt. And perhaps that is where it begins. Not with recognition, not with support, but with a quiet decision to continue. Even when no one stands beside you, even when the silence feels endless. Even then, he did not stop. There were moments when the silence around him felt almost deliberate, as if it had chosen him. Not harsh, not cruel, just distant. Like a door that never fully opened. No matter how gently he approached, they continued to speak, but never to him. Their voices carried across the space he stood in, passing through as though he were not part of it. It was not rejection in a loud, visible way. It was something quieter, something harder to explain. To be present, and yet not included. Have you ever stood in a place where you felt invisible? Even while others moved all around you. He noticed how easily they formed their thoughts about him. Quick conclusions, built on fragments, a glance, a moment, a single impression. And from that, they believed they understood, but they did not see the hours behind his efforts. They did not feel the weight he carried in silence, and he knew they wouldn't ask. At times, a quiet urge would rise within him, a desire to explain, to fill the empty space with words, to say, "You don't see everything," to offer them a clearer picture of who he was and what he was trying to do. But each time, that urge faded just as gently as it came, because something within him hesitated. Would they truly listen? Or would his words simply become another sound, quickly heard and quickly forgotten? So he remained still, not out of weakness, but out of a quiet uncertainty. A sense that not every silence needs to be broken, that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Still, it wasn't easy. There were nights when the quiet felt deeper than usual, when the absence of support echoed louder than any voice could. In those moments, he could feel the edges of loneliness, not sharp, but present. A reminder that he was walking a path few seemed to notice. And yet, even then, he did not turn back. There is a kind of strength that does not show itself in action, but in restraint, in choosing not to speak when words are ready, in choosing not to react when emotions begin to rise. He began to see this more clearly. Their words, their assumptions, they moved around him like passing wind. At first, he felt each one. He noticed the tone, the meaning behind them. But over time, something changed. He stopped reaching for them, not because they no longer existed, but because he no longer needed to hold on to them. Is it possible to hear something and yet not carry it? He discovered that it was. Slowly, he created a space within himself, a quiet distance between what they said and what he allowed himself to feel. And in that space, something unexpected began to grow. Not pride, not resistance, just calm. A calm that did not depend on their understanding, a calm that did not need their approval. It was small at first, almost fragile, but it stayed. And that was enough. They continued, as they always had, unaware of the shift taking place within him. To them, nothing had changed. He was still the same quiet presence, still moving without drawing attention. But within, the silence was no longer empty. It was becoming something else, something steady, something strong. And though no one stood beside him, he was no longer standing alone in the same way. There came a quiet moment when he began to see things differently. Not because anything around him had changed, but because something within him had softened and settled. The silence no longer pressed against him in the same way. It no longer asked him to prove anything or to fill it with words. Instead, it simply remained, and he remained with it. He started to notice how often people spoke without truly seeing, how easily they filled empty spaces with assumptions, as if certainty was more comfortable than understanding. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to correct them. What would change if he did? Would they suddenly understand him? Would they listen more carefully? Or simply hear what they expected to hear? These questions passed through his mind, not with frustration, but with a quiet clarity. And in that clarity, he found something unexpected: freedom. The freedom to let things be misunderstood. It is not an easy thing to allow others to see you incorrectly and remain at peace with it. It goes against something deep within us, the desire to be known, to be seen as we truly are. He felt that desire too, but he also began to understand that not every truth needs to be explained to those who are not ready to see it. And not every silence is a sign of weakness. Sometimes it is a form of protection, a quiet way of holding on to something that does not need to be exposed. So he chose, again and again, not to react. Not in a forced way, not by pushing his feelings aside, but by letting them pass through him without turning them into action. Like watching a ripple move across still water and then fade. There is a certain dignity in that. They continued to speak. Their voices still carried the same tones, the same quiet judgments. But he noticed something had changed. He was no longer listening in the same way. Their words no longer reached as deeply. Not because he had become distant or cold, but because he had stopped placing his worth in their understanding. And without that weight, their voices became lighter, easier to release. Have you ever realized that not everything deserves a response? That some things lose their power when they are not answered? He began to feel this more clearly with each passing day. The space between what happened around him and how he responded to it grew wider. And in that space, there was peace. Not a loud, overwhelming peace. A quiet one. The kind that sits gently within you. Asking nothing, proving nothing. Just existing, steady, and calm. He did not speak about this change. There was no need to. It was not something meant to be shown or explained. It was something to be lived. And so he continued forward in the same quiet way. But now, each step carried less weight, not because the world had become kinder or more understanding, but because he had stopped carrying what was never his to hold: their doubts, their assumptions, their distance. He let them remain where they belonged, outside of him. And within that boundary, he found something that had always been there, waiting quietly. A sense of self that did not depend on being seen. A strength that did not need to be heard. It was not loud. It did not demand attention, but it stayed. And for the first time, the silence around him no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. And in that space, he was finally at ease. Time passed quietly, without announcement. Nothing dramatic marked the change. No moment where everything suddenly became clear to others. They continued as they always had, speaking, assuming, moving on. But something deeper had already taken place. He no longer waited to be understood. That quiet expectation, the one that once sat beneath his actions, had slowly disappeared. He no longer looked for signs, no longer measured his worth by what was reflected back to him. And without that need, something within him became steady, almost unshakable. It is a subtle shift the moment you stop seeking recognition, not because you no longer care, but because you no longer depend on it. Have you ever felt that kind of stillness, where nothing outside of you needs to change for you to feel at peace? He moved through his days with the same calm presence. His steps were not louder, his voice no stronger. If anything, he seemed even more quiet than before. But now, that quiet held something different. It held certainty. They began to notice, though they could not quite explain it. There was something in the way he carried himself, the way he no longer reacted, no longer reached for approval. It was not visible in a clear way, but it could be felt. And feelings, they travel farther than words. Without speaking, he had drawn a boundary, not one that pushed others away, but one that protected what was his. His energy, his focus, his sense of self, no longer open to every passing opinion. And because of that, their words began to lose their place. They still spoke, of course, but their voices no longer shaped anything within him. They passed by like distant echoes, unable to reach the space he had created. There is a quiet power in that, not the kind that controls others or proves a point, but the kind that simply remains untouched. He did not use his silence to resist them. He did not hold it as a shield in anger. It was softer than that, more natural. Like a calm that had always been there, now finally allowed to exist. And in that calm, his actions began to speak in ways words never could, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. Each step forward, each quiet effort, carried a weight that did not need to be announced. It showed itself over time in ways that could not be ignored forever. They started to see it, not because he explained it, but because it was there, unmoving, real. And perhaps That is how history is often written, not in moments of noise or attention, but in long stretches of quiet persistence, in the unseen effort that continues without recognition, until one day it can no longer be overlooked. He never turned back to acknowledge the silence he once stood in. He did not revisit it, did not question it. It had already given him what it needed to give. A deeper understanding, a quieter strength, and now he carried that with him, not as something to show, but as something to show, but as something to live. Without urgency, without doubt. Just a calm, steady presence that moved forward, untouched by what once tried to define it. And in the end, without ever raising his voice, without ever asking to be seen, he became impossible to ignore, not because he changed for them, but because he remained true to himself, even when no one stood beside him, and that was enough.